is we have a huge problem. You've heard about that. The second is that everything has to be on the table. We can't solve this problem doing just one thing. And the third is that if we don't do anything, the consequences are terribly serious. I'm going to talk about taxes. Not a popular subject. I don't like my taxes going up, but I think if you look at the math, there's no way we can get to where we need to be by just cutting spending. We're going to have to do it all. So what are our revenue options? Let's see if I can get these slides going. Here are the 5 major options that I think need to be discussed. And let me just briefly talk about each of them. The first one is letting the so-called Bush tax cuts, the cuts that occurred in 2001 and 2003, expire. This is an unaffordable expense going forward to leave them where they are. It would cost us something like $3 trillion to extend all of them. I don't know any economist who thinks that they should be extended. There is a debate, and yet in the political system, you have both Democrats and Republicans and the President of the United States saying they should be extended. The only difference is that Republicans want them extended for everyone, and Democrats want them extended just for the middle class. My contention is both are unaffordable. There is an issue about whether we should let them expire in the middle of a downturn, and we can come back to that if you like. But the main point is they're unaffordable. The next issue is reforming income taxes. I probably don't have to tell anyone in this room that the system is broken. It's way too complex. It is inefficient. It has all kinds of special deductions and special preferences that distort economic activity and lose us a bunch of revenue, about $1 trillion a year for all of the special deductions and preferences. We hope that after this midterm election or sometime in the next couple of years, there can be a major overhaul of this system. We haven't had one since 1986. That would help a lot. If we did it right, we could probably both raise revenues and perhaps reduce some rates, including the corporate rate, which is one of the highest in the world. We could tax energy. This is a no-brainer. We have a problem. We are way too dependent on countries that aren't particularly friendly or stable for our energy supplies. We have a problem with climate change, and we need the revenues. But again, our politics are getting in the way of doing what would really be a triple win for the United States. We could tax consumption. Has already been said, we don't save enough in this country. Savings rate is going up a little bit now because people are trying to rebuild their balance sheets after the financial crisis. But in general, our savings rate have been incredibly low. What does every other advanced country other than the U.S. do? They rely much more heavily on consumption taxes than they do on income taxes. In Europe, tax burdens are much higher than they are in the U.S. You all know that. But if you look at the composition of taxes in Europe, they rely more heavily on consumption taxes proportionately and less heavily on income taxes. That is a more efficient and more pro-growth tax system. And a value-added tax is a big revenue raiser. Conservatives don't like it for that reason. They call it a money machine. Liberals don't like it because it tends to be regressive. I think there are ways to fix both problems that we can come back to if you're interested. What about payroll taxes? We've already talked about Social Security, and there is, of course, a huge amount of revenue that comes in to pay for that program, although, as Dave mentioned, we are now getting into a situation of cash deficits in Social Security. So when people say to you, oh, well, the Social Security Trust Fund isn't going to go into the red until 2037, think hard about what that means. Already it's in a cash deficit. It just means that there's going to be obligations of one part of the government to another part of the government. It doesn't mean there are any real assets or any real money there. So we could do something to the benefit side of Social Security and simultaneously do something to the payroll tax. The most common proposal here is to raise the cap on earnings, which right now is around $106,000. Above that, you don't pay any Social Security taxes. So I'll leave it there. These are all for discussion. We are going to have to do some of all of this probably. Thanks.
Okay, as Sarah Inhofe has just reminded me, we have copies of all the slides up the front table, and also they either are or will shortly be available on our website at some point later today. So let's take Q&A, and Doug has the microphone. Yes.
What do you see for the future of states which can't print money in terms of California, New York, and some other states? What do you see the end game for states that are in English?
Well, when I was Comptroller General of the United States and head of the GAO, I got the GAO to get in the business of looking at structural deficits for state and local governments. If you deal with the state level, you'll find that latest statistics I think is about 42 of the 50 states face structural deficits. Driven primarily by Medicaid costs, underfunded pension plans, unfunded retiree health plans, and critical infrastructure needs. They vary, by scope and magnitude and timing. But frankly, government's grown too big at all levels. It added a number of programs and entities in good times. And it's going to have to restructure. In particular, it's going to have to restructure pension and health obligations because when you end up comparing the benefit provisions for many state and local government plans, and you compare it against major employer plans in the states or localities, they don't pass a straight face test. And you're not going to be able to solve the problem merely by dealing with new employees. You're going to have to do some things with regard to the existing system, if you will. They're going to feel the crunch quicker because the credit rating agencies are less tolerant. They can't print money. And in fact, if you look at it, there's increasing interdependency and interconnectivity. Localities rely on the states rely on the federal government. We all have serious problems. So we're all in this boat together, and we're all going to have to make major transformational reforms.
So, first off, I'm just really impressed that the four of you would be up there, and I saw the movie IOUSA and the work that you've all done. So you've got a personal stake in what's going on for the country, obviously. So it's kind of a two-part question, and I don't know if we want all four answer, or just one of you take a stab at it, but you're here personally doing something. When you're not here doing this conversation, I know there's some work that we all can be doing to spread the word. What is it that you folks see as solutions when you go back to your desks or your families? What do you personally sink your time into? Is it politics? Is it, battling the economic war? That kind of question. Thank you.
Well, I don't have a personal life. This is it. That's the sad fact. So what I think about is, particularly now that the Red Sox season is over, and that wasn't the great news story either. I really am into citizen engagement on this. I mean, that's really been the fundamental, one of the driving forces of the Concord Coalition. Paul Tsongas, when he and Warren Rudman started the Concord Coalition, Paul Tsongas said, look, there are a lot of good budget organizations in Washington. We don't need to be a think tank. We should have some sort of presence outside of Washington because there's a grassroots constituency, believe it or not, for fiscal responsibility. He had felt it in his own campaign, so he knew that the public was receptive and not necessarily didn't have any vehicle for expressing that. So a lot of what we do at the Concord Coalition is this sort of dual message. I mean, I testify in front of Congress, and I'm in touch with members of the administration, members of the congressional staff and that sort of thing. But we also have a presence outside of Washington because it's important for citizens to be engaged in this activity. And the reason why is, think about the level of distrust there is in government right now. And so the more people just simply, if the politicians were to come up with a plan, a lot of people just wouldn't trust it because there's no trust in the politicians. So I think in solving these problems, my part, there's a lot of ways you could do it. You can do it through a liberal way, you can do it through a conservative way, you can be fiscally responsible either way. Paul Songer's always said, it doesn't really matter what size government, as long as you're willing to pay for the size government that you want, which we're not willing to do right now. And a lot of that has to do with public engagement. And while I'm on that, and I'll shut up in a minute, but since there are 3 Concord staff people here I want to introduce you all to, because we're going to be around New Hampshire, we have been, but we will be continually this year. One is Sarah Imhoff from in the back, who also she's from Iowa. And we were in Iowa last week, no particular reason, but we were. And Jeff Fiebert, who is our New England Regional Coordinator, is in the back there, and Stefan Berg-Kruger, who is our Youth Outreach Coordinator and this morning Technical Advisor. And Steve Marchand is our former mayor of Portsmouth, is working with us, and a longtime Concord volunteer. So that's my pitch. Public engagement is real important.
I'll be brief. 3 things. One, I'm starting a new initiative called the Come Back America Initiative later this month. It's going to be based in Connecticut. It's going to be 75% based on federal, 25% based on state and local, structural deficits, trying to help Democrats, Republicans, and Independents who want to engage the public with the facts, the truth, and solutions. That's publicly. And then behind the scenes trying to work with leaders to try to develop solutions and get them enacted. Secondly, Americans for Campaign Finance Reform. I'm on the advisory board for that. John is here, who's chairman of the board. We desperately need campaign finance reform along with redistricting reform, open primaries, and 12 to 18-year term limits. Thirdly, I'm involved in another group that I know Steve's involved with called NoLabels.org. Check it out, www.nolabels.org. That is a new group that's going to be launched in December of this year that is reaching out to concerned Republicans, Democrats, and Independents who believe the country is on a dangerous course, and is going to focus on about 6 issues and build a grass-tops and grassroots movement around the United States, building for 2012, to try to support people who want to solve these problems and to try to diminish the influence of the wings, the far left and the far right, because that's not where the solutions are. As I said, change course or crash.
So my favorite moment in politics, and this is the right crowd for this story, is actually Paul Songer's, who was at a press conference and was asked a question, a very pointed one. He said, "That's a great question. Let me try to evade you." It's inspired me for years. So that's a great question. Let me try to evade you. For me, this is simple. I mean, we are going to change course, and the question is how. One way to do it is for the international financial community to say, you guys are no longer creditworthy, we do not trust you with our money, and you can just drop dead. And we will have a destructive financial crisis, recession, consequences of which will be felt for years. The other way to do it is to actually proactively decide on our own to get our act together. And I have dedicated most of my recent life to the notion that that is more likely if people are better informed, some public education. It's shocking how many people don't understand the magnitudes involved, still believe that if we just cut off foreign aid, things will be fine, stuff like that. Number 2, I've openly dabbled in politics. We've got to get our candidates, our elected officials to understand these problems and make it good politics to do the right thing. And I claim no great successes on that front, but I do believe that's the thing to do. And if we can get voters, reward people for doing the right thing instead of punishing them and voting them out of office when they raise taxes, cut spending, and we have politicians who recognize that the right thing will be good politics, it will preserve this country's freedom and prosperity, then I think we'll solve this on our own. This is a pivotal moment. We have lost the luxury of time. All these problems happen in a decade, and the magnitudes are unprecedented in my lifetime.
I hate to prolong this. I want to second everything that's already been said and remind us that after 9/11 there was a lot of talk about how we were ready to sacrifice, and now we seem to have lost that sense of community, that sense of pulling together to do the tough things here. And I, as my very, very small sacrifice, spend a lot of time sitting on airplanes and tarmacs, as I did last night, as I did a week or so ago, to do this kind of thing. And then more seriously, the screen up there tells you what I do the rest of the time. Thank you.
If I didn't say it, thank you for what you do.
Absolutely.
Two questions. One is, when you talked about healthcare, you didn't address the issue of tort reform, which isn't addressed in the healthcare bill, because a lot of the procedures are defensive that doctors perform, which drives up costs, obviously. And secondly, what's going to happen with the deficit commission? Is it going to come out with meaningful recommendations, in your view, or is it going to be like the Social Security reform, where it just sits on a shelf and nothing happens?
So there are too many things in healthcare to cover them all, so it's a good question. I think there are two favorite solutions that are offered, one on the left, one on the right, that are actually not solutions. Tort reform is one of them. We need tort reform. In my view, there's an enormous amount of defensive medicine out there, and lots of evidence that if we fixed our liability laws, we'd get rid of a lot of it. But the trouble is, that's sort of a layer of extra cost on top of the system, and if you got rid of it, sure, the system would be cheaper, but the real problem is the trajectory of growth, and that's driven by very different factors. And so you might get a couple of years respite from the cost growth if you did a good tort reform, but we'd still have to deal with the underlying drivers of adoptions of technologies that are very expensive and without a value consideration, things like that. On the left, the favorite thing to beat up on is insurance companies. And again, we have a national health care bill, and insurance is a part of it that shifts around who pays that bill. And if insurance companies are inefficient, then that's an extra layer of cost on top of the national health care bill. If you squeeze that down somehow, sure, you'll get again some one-time savings, but it's the underlying bill, which keeps getting bigger every year, in which we don't get our money's worth, but is the issue. And so those are nice, both of them. There's no reason not to do them, but they aren't permanent solutions to our problem.
I think, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, you want to do the commission?
Oh, the commission? My own view is that I don't have high hopes for the commission. I'm probably the most pessimistic about it. I mean, the very first presidential commission was appointed by George Washington to peacefully solve the Whiskey Rebellion. And history will show he had to send in the troops. So thus was set the precedent of all presidential commissions. I'm not holding my breath.
On tort reform, I think we need to consider a number of things, two of which in particular. We need to move away from jury trials with regard to this. I think we need special courts to deal with healthcare like we have for bankruptcy. And secondly, we need to go to evidence-based medical practices for reimbursements and as a safe harbor for medical malpractice. If you practice in accordance with the evidence-based standards, you have a safe harbor, if you will. With regard to commission, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to get 14 out of 18 votes on recommendations. They're going to try in a few areas. Even if they get it, they're not going to get a vote, I think, in the Senate, because the politics are going to end up changing. I think the real hope is that they'll end up reinforcing the case of change course or crash, and that President Obama will be able to take what they do and incorporate it into his next budget submission and or legislative agenda. Ultimately, the president's got to lead on this. If the president doesn't lead, we're going nowhere fast. And I think 2011 is a real pivotal year for Obama as to whether or not he's going to be a leader or not on these issues.
Well, let me just add on the commission. I agree with that. There's another commission chaired by Alice Rivlin and former Senate Budget Committee Chairman Pete Domenici, which is formed by the Bipartisan Policy Center. I mention that because I'm on that commission. And we're doing the same thing that the official commission is doing, and we'll be making a recommendation. And in fact, Alice Rivlin, who's co-chairing our commission, is on the presidential commission, so she's kind of unique in having that perspective. She doesn't leak to one side or the other, but she has an interesting perspective by serving on both. But we're doing parallel efforts. Our report will come out in November. Judd Gregg is on that commission. He's on the official commission, he's not on ours. But so we'll be coming out with our recommendations in mid-November, and that should be fairly interesting as well. So I'll keep you all apprised of that.
Thank you for being here, appreciate it. I'm one of the many Americans that lost faith in their two political parties to do the right thing and come up with the best solutions. With two little kids, I want to do everything I can to evolve the impending doom that you're obviously predicting is coming here. So my hobby is trying to figure out what we can be doing. And it's obviously, like as you said, it's getting involved, the grassroots, one person at a time. I've been struggling how to do that. So one of the things I think you hit on is measurements and metrics. Is we've got to give the people the measurements and metrics to hold whoever is we've given the jobs of representing us to know that they're doing the job. And it's not issues. Everyone's got issues. We've got problems. And forcing you, this is a role you guys could have, is establishing the measurements and metrics to know that they're making those improvements year in and year out. One of them I've always thought of is you said that half the debt is owned by foreigners. It's $650 billion. Is that 1 out of 5 houses, that are owned by China? Put things in terms that really get at the everyday person's medicine. What's happening with them. The other one is, 12 years ago, I went out to dinner with a bunch of first-year doctors. They said 12 years ago, the business of medicine is broken. And you've all said it. We have to, as long as we agree we're going to be a capitalist society, we've got to make those things happen. So we've got to put the measurements and metrics around moving it and hold our, politicians, the people we hire, to get those things done. The other one is, hopefully you're plugged in with the Live Free or Die Alliance here in New Hampshire. It's a great way of getting that message debate across here as a website. So.
I'll start. First, believe it or not, the United States government has been in existence since 1789. It still has no strategic plan. None. All right? The closest thing it has is an annual budget. That's not a strategic plan. It is a policy decision to allocate resources. Secondly, it doesn't have a set of key outcome-based indicators: economic, safety, security, social, environmental. Thirdly, it doesn't end up benchmarking itself against other major industrialized nations. All right? When you're trying to assess performance, you have to know how are you doing based on outcomes. Are you getting better or worse? And how do you compare your peer group? I believe very strongly that there's some things going on in the healthcare bill. One of the positive aspects of the healthcare bill, there was actually a provision in there to create a public-private partnership to be able to come up with a set of metrics. It could be federal, state, local, that would be outcome-oriented, that would be available to the public, that would help hold people more accountable. I'm all for something like that. And I'm working right now to try to develop a fiscal responsibility index that could end up being publicized and tracked over time as to where we stand and how we compare to other countries. So I think metrics and measurements are very important, and there more that needs to be done on that. I would agree with you in that regard.
I'll get you next.
Thank you. A couple of, I guess, one question for the group. One, with respect to the No Labels organization, is energy one of the 6 issues? 2, I'm told that in a conversation a colleague had with Alice Rivlin that a carbon tax was not part of the recommendations from on the commission, Bob. And I guess 3, if energy were taxed, if there was a carbon tax, where does the money go? Is it revenue neutral? Senator Collins has a cap and cash program, dividends back to taxpayers, reducing payroll taxes. So I guess that's 3 questions related to energy and solutions.
On No Labels, I'm involved in the national leadership team for No Labels. They haven't decided what the 6 issues are going to be, roughly 6 issues. I think it's a very high probability that energy/environment will be one of those 6, very high probability. Fiscal's clearly on it, but I think it's very high. Secondly, I'm co-chairing a special effort that's being funded by Carnegie, that Bill Bradley, former senator, and Tom Kean, former governor, and I have formed kind of a nonpartisan group, Democrat, Republican, Independent, respectively, to try to look at surface transportation as one example of an area that's badly broken, and what do we need to do. One of the issues that's on the table there is some type of a energy tax or carbon tax, and what would happen with it. One of the things that we really have to do a better job of is critical infrastructure. Our infrastructure is in terrible shape. A lot of the things that we ended up doing through the stimulus bill was really, patchwork, not really creating a new infrastructure that will end up improving our competitive advantage. And so I think, what you do with the money matters a lot. And we need to move away from consumption and more towards investment and things that will help improve our competitive posture and generate more economic growth.
I think that a carbon tax is not about to happen politically. So that's point one. Too bad in my view, because I think there's hardly anyone who's looked seriously at the problem that doesn't think it would both reduce consumption and increase production of alternative fuels, and do so in a much more efficient way than a system of regulation and subsidies for ethanol and all the other stuff that we have right now. Cap and trade has been the U.S. version of a carbon tax. If you auction off the emissions permits, it has a lot of similarity to a carbon tax. Just doesn't seem quite as blatant to people. Your question about what happens to the money is absolutely right on point. That is a big problem, but in the sense that there'll be all kinds of interests fighting for that money, and Senator Collins' notion that maybe you need to return some of the money to consumers, I think is right. One notion that's out there that I like is that you could initially use a lot of the revenue to return it to people, particularly while the economy is still depressed. Imagine, for example, if you had a payroll tax holiday that you paid for with this carbon tax, but then over time, the payroll tax holiday would gradually go away as the economy recovered, and increasingly more and more of the revenues from the tax would then flow back into the federal treasury to reduce the deficit. So there are various creative ways to do this, in my view. The problem is the politics of it.
I think on the commission, I don't know what they're going to come up with. I think that I suspect that there'll be some carbon tax proposal that will come out of some commission this fall, but I'm not sure from which. On the, but I think on the what do you do with the money question too. I mean, just to follow up on what Bill said, is that we tend to look at a lot of proposals as in a pay-go sense, which is, how do you prevent the deficit from getting worse, or if you're going to raise the carbon tax, can you use it to fund some new initiative or to cut another tax elsewhere? And the point that I want to make is that we need to go beyond pay-go. Pay-go isn't good enough. Pay-go keeps us treading water as we're going over Niagara Falls. And that's not good enough right now. We have to be able, I would say if we're going to do something with a carbon tax, we ought to use it partially anyway for deficit reduction and not just to be revenue neutral. This is classic. I mean, what Doug said before, healthcare reform. There's a lot of stuff that was used in healthcare reform that could have been used to improve the long-term fiscal outlook, but it was used to pay for new entitlements. And so even if it all works as planned, and I share Doug's skepticism on that, but even if it all works as planned, you're not improving the situation. So I wouldn't want to do the same thing with a new tax and say we're going to have a new tax, but we're going to cut some other tax. That might help improve the efficiency of the tax system, which would be worth doing. But in terms of addressing the deficit problems, we need to go beyond that.
How many of you have seen Popeye, the cartoon Popeye? Please raise your hand. Remember the character Wimpy? I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. Washington has wimpy fiscal policies. I will gladly make the tough choices on Tuesday if you let me give you a new government program, expand spending, and in fairness, a tax cut that we may or may not be able to afford today. But Tuesday never comes. And the health care bill is a perfect example. Doug may be going to jump in here. If our health care system was a house, it's structurally unsound, mortgaged for more than it's worth, and headed for foreclosure. So what did Washington do? We're going to add a new wing onto it. And we may or may not have paid for it. We can debate that. But it's attached to a structure that's structurally unsound, mortgaged for more than it's worth, and headed for foreclosure. You know, you just can't tread water. We're in a deep hole. And we have to start figuring out how we're going to end up dealing with it.
So two observations, and full disclosure, I've worked with Roger on this carbon issue, trying to explain to my conservative colleagues why he's sensible to get into this business. And the first on the politics is, it's fundamentally broken. I mean, I was in the White House in 89, 90 when we did the acid rain program, which was a cap and trade, and we had to beat the liberals, John Dingell in particular, with a lead pipe to get it through, because we were using these crazy market forces to fix an environmental problem. And it worked beautifully. And it's shocking to find now that both the cap and trade and the carbon tax, which are identical policies on a blackboard, in which you can really use interchangeably in a lot of ways, they're now anathema to Republicans. They have instead swung around to do all the things that we were trying to fix. You know, ad hoc subsidies, regulatory imposition, all sorts of things. So I don't know how to fix that, Roger. I mean, you know, we've had this conversation. I think we have to work hard on it. Second thing to notice about this phenomenon, David's got this exactly right. What did we do in the healthcare bill? We actually created a new entitlement. We actually created two. They grow at 8% a year as far as the eye can see, without fixing the existing ones. If you look at the Cantwell-Collins bill, probably the best piece of climate legislation currently in the Congress, what does it do? It actually creates a new entitlement. There are checks for people coming out of the carbon tax, which is really what that is, the disguised carbon tax, as far as the eye can see. We've got to get out of the business of creating new entitlements where people expect to get a check from the government for one purpose or another all the time. And until we fix that, we are not going to stop digging a hole.
Hi, thank you all very much. I'm fascinated to hear you all speak. One of my favorite sayings these days is, it's impossible to get someone to understand something when their paycheck depends on them not understanding it. And I also look at our government as a Walmart, and I see the Walmart destroying American businesses, sending them overseas, charging us less and less and less money for worse and worse and worse products. And I'm wondering, would you all comment on that and how you feel that type of business practice fits into what you are discussing?
I'm a deep believer that, in fact, you know, if you look at our governments, this is a democracy, and in the end, the responsibility lies with the voters. We get the governments we want and or tolerate. I mean, there is no question about that, and a big part of what we're trying to do is to make sure that people recognize this and actually ask for a different government, one that is more responsive, not just to the immediate needs of short-term satisfaction, but to the traditional commitments we've had to leave behind an economy that's larger and stronger than the one we inherited, to leave behind to our children the freedoms we've enjoyed, and we are on track to endanger all of that. And so, to me, the broken business model is the retail politics, which says, I will elect you, and I want less in the way of taxes and more in the way of services. And that simply will not be possible over the foreseeable future. I mean, we're going to see every level of government saying to its constituents, we're going to provide you with fewer services and we would like higher taxes. And I predict it's going to be a bumpy ride for the next 5-6 years, because the incumbents are going to be extremely unpopular if traditional politics holds. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, is a sort of anti-incumbency. And 2 years from now, we'll probably throw another batch of incumbents out, and the question is, will we ultimately change the way that politics work? Because we have to, and we simply cannot continue down this road.
Let me touch on a little bit. First, companies do not have duties of loyalty to countries. They do not, okay? And a lot of politicians don't understand that. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. Now, progressive companies will end up looking to try to take care of broader stakeholders. They'll also be concerned about their community. They'll also not just be concerned about today, they'll be concerned about what are the trends that can affect their position in the future. And quite frankly, I think that business leaders and young people are not engaged on this issue to the extent that they should be, because if we have a crash, everybody's going to suffer, not just domestically, but globally, all right? And so I think that we need to do that. But secondly, I think, Walmart is obviously in the private sector. It's trying to do its part with regard to its, fiduciary responsibilities, and we can debate whether it's doing it right or not. But the duty of loyalty for elected officials is the country. All right, and I would respectfully suggest one of the problems we have is we have something that the founding fathers never intended. It's called career politicians who stay in the same job year after year after year. And they're human beings. They want to keep that job. People don't normally want to lose their job involuntarily, right? And so as a result, a lot of the things they do, because of what Doug said, because ultimately we the people are responsible and accountable for what does or doesn't happen, they're doing what they have to do to get elected and get reelected. My view is that citizens have a lot more responsibility, but they need to be told the truth, and they need to understand what the tough choices are. But that we also need to have political reforms, as I talked about before, redistricting reform, open primaries, campaign finance reform, and term limits. And the reason being is because we've got to make really tough, transformative changes. And you need to shake up the system to get that done. Little changes to the same system with the same people is not going to give you different results.
I just wanted to say there was a guy that said you can't handle the truth. So that's my big fear. A lot of people won't be able to handle the truth. So how are you going to break through? I mean, I know what you're all about, but how do you break through that barrier where people? It's going to be a hard lesson for a lot of people. They can be lulled into thinking that they can keep sailing along the way, and you talk to many people today, and they're oblivious to this, and they're not interested.
I would disagree with that. I mean, a lot of us have been on the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour, Fiscal Solutions Tour. I just did inventory the other day. I've been in 39 states, 400 speeches in the last 2.5 years, doing a lot of town hall meetings. If you look at survey work, the public understands it's a big problem. I mean, it's the politicians that are the lag indicator. Now, where it breaks down is what do you do about it? All right, so the public understands we're living beyond our means, spending's out of control. They're concerned about escalating deficits and debt. They don't like increased reliance on foreign lenders. It's the number 2 issue to the economy and jobs, and the gap is growing between that and everything else. By the way, it was way ahead of healthcare reform before healthcare reform got enacted into law. So the fact is the problem's in Washington. But what we have to do is help people understand what are some of the solutions. That's why this is the Fiscal Solutions Tour. And we need to start focusing, what do we need to do? And you need to have a plan, and the math has to work. That's the new 4-letter word in Washington, math.
Relative to your inventory, and you were saying I didn't have a private life. I mean, God, you're running around 39 states and my goodness. Well, I think that what we find is typically that the people do understand a choice, and I think that one of the problems is the way these things are communicated, through the media. It's very difficult. Let's face it, what works on television is conflict, and so people will get one side and the other side, and instead of trying to hash out some sort of agreement or look for points of agreement, you look for the points of conflict and then emphasize them, and so it makes getting to consensus very difficult. On the other hand, I think people are much more realistic about these things than meets the eye. That's what we've continually found. So I think the problem is creating an environment where that can be emphasized rather than a substantive problem where people are unwilling to compromise. It's finding a better community engagement, political engagement mechanism.
I was just going to add that not only does the public need to start taking responsibility in terms of who they elect, but they've got to be informed enough to elect people who will do something sensible. I hate to personalize this, but think about what's just happened with Mike Castle and Christine O'Donnell. I'm a Democrat, but I worked with Mike Castle for many years on a number of different issues. He is a terrific public servant, absolutely well-informed, sensible guy with a depth of experience. And the fact that the voters have now returned someone like Christine O'Donnell to replace him speaks volumes symbolically to me about what's wrong with our politics. It isn't just the elected officials, it's some of the choices that people are making.
Absolutely.
And I'm afraid that right now, because people are angry and frustrated for good reasons, that they are going to reach out and elect people who are extremist on one side or the other, and that's not going to be good for the country either. That could actually be quite as dangerous as everything that we're talking about up here.
Yeah, I'm listening to all this, and I'm recently involved in local politics. Is this on?
Yep.
And it strikes me that we're talking a lot about electing officials who will do the right thing, and yet I think it goes beyond that. And I'll give you an example of the Portsmouth budget process. We recently have 4 members of a 9-member council that are quite fiscally responsible and want to keep spending under control to keep the tax rate down. We have public hearings, 500 people show up and say spend more money on various things that they want. And we have 5 people show up and say keep the budget under control. So we have a room full of people here who want to have fiscal responsibility, and we need those people. You've got to get involved locally and speak up during the budget process. Now the interesting thing happens, the budget got a little larger than we wanted it to be, now everybody's complaining about the tax bill. So you have a public who wants things, but when the tax bill comes, now they're complaining at us for letting taxes go up. So we need people that understand this process to get out at the public hearings and do something. Most people are afraid to say anything.
Well, that's an important point. You know, a lot of people don't realize that it doesn't take that many people coming to town hall meetings or public hearings or whatever to have an impact and to make a difference. And, you know, elected officials, you know, care obviously about people who can vote for them. Vote them in, vote them out. And you're talking about the local level, but, you know, whether it's your senators or your state, you know, or your members of Congress, you have a situation where, you know, a few people showing up and pressing people for answers and holding them accountable can make a real difference.
Thank you. Two-part quick question, which we don't have time to discuss extensively, but first point, I'd like to hear more discussion about the criteria for making these decisions. You put up a lot of options on the screen, but not much discussion about criteria for choosing among the alternatives. Second point, and it goes in the direction of criteria, there is one person out there who has not been wimpy and done the math, and that's Erskine Bowles. He gave a presentation to the National Governors Association in Boston a couple months ago. Quick background, if you look at the consensus of economic research related to closing a fiscal gap, most people who've looked at countries that have been successful come up with a ratio about 80-20. 80% of closing that gap should come from cost reductions, 20% should come from tax increases. Not being wimpy and having done the math, Erskine Bowles in Boston a couple months ago said, much to my surprise publicly, that one of the principles that he was working on was to close the gap using 75% cost reductions, 25% tax increases, revenue increases, which I think is a very courageous position for somebody in a political environment to put a mark in the sand. I'd like some comments probably on the economics of that from that side of the panel, and the politics of that from the other side of the panel, about getting to that kind of what I would call economically efficient, effective outcome.
So I think the criteria should be which will aid growth. We have to be ruthlessly pro-growth in this environment. We're growing poorly now. There's good reasons for that coming out of the financial crisis. We have real issues in providing a standard of living to our children and meeting a lot of the obligations we accrued from the past. So I think you have to say, okay, let's look at the menu on the table. Which one will solve the fiscal problem and aid economic growth? That to me is the way we should think about this. The evidence is exactly as you cited it. And the reality is that if you somehow wanted to ignore that evidence, we will not tax our way out of this problem. If you look at the stated course trajectory of spending, it gets so large, 38% of GDP at the federal level, that you could not imagine taxing your way out of it without crippling the economy. You have to be a crazy supply sider to arrive at that conclusion. So I'm in the begin as you mean to go on camp, and we should begin, cutting spending. Now this is hard. I mean, my side, the conservatives, always talk about cutting spending, but the less numerate ones who haven't learned a four-letter word don't understand that if you want to meet the president's criteria, what the commission's been tasked to do, strictly on the spending side, you are allowed to let total federal spending, annual discretionary spending, entitlements, the whole thing, grow at the princely rate of 0.1% per year for 5 years. So if you want to do that on the spending side, you basically have to say we're going to freeze federal spending, top line, for 5 years. I will stipulate that will be unprecedented in my experience. And then if you want to do it on the revenue side, you have to raise revenues at the annual rate of 12% a year for 5 years. Now some of that's just recovery from the recession. There's a lot of tax increases in there. So it's nice to have the sort of qualitative rhetorical discussion, but if you do the arithmetic, this is something that will be very difficult to do, but it's the way we have to begin, and we'll see.
I agree with the criteria of growth and efficiency. I would add that the sacrifice is going to be large, whether it's on spending cuts or revenue increases, and so you do have to care about how that's distributed across the population. It has to be viewed as fair. And we've had a lot of prosperity in recent decades that hasn't been very broadly distributed. I'm sure you're all aware of what's happened to the distribution of income in this country. Most of the growth has gone to the very top of the distribution. That's well known now, and I think the middle class in this country has been treading water for too long, even before the recession. So I would be concerned about that in terms of any mix of particular solutions. That said, on this spending versus taxes, I think I agree with Doug that in the longer term, there's no way you can do this mainly through revenues because the growth in Medicare and Social Security is, in the healthcare programs especially, is unending. So you'd have to have ever increasing taxes, and pretty soon all of your income would be devoted to taxes. That obviously doesn't work. But in the short run, keep in mind, and this is just another way of saying what he was saying, 70% of all revenues right now go to just 3 programs: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The beneficiaries of those 3 programs are overwhelmingly the elderly. So if you want to put all of the burden in the shorter run, I'm talking about the next 5 or 10 years, on the spending side of the budget, you can't do it without tampering with the benefits of people who are already retired, unless you were so draconian on everything else the federal government did that it's just a laughable scenario. So in the shorter run, we're either going to continue to run deficits or we're going to have to do more of it on the revenue side.
I think clearly when you're making tough choices like this, one of the places you have to start is start with a set of principles and values. There's no question about that. You know, my personal view is when you talk about your kind of ratio, that's not the principle and value. It may come out, you know, of those principles and values. If you look at the United Kingdom, for example, the new coalition government has agreed on an 80-20 ratio. Now, they tax at a higher level than we do, so you've got to keep that in mind as well, so when you're considering the benchmark. My personal view is that you have to separate the short to medium range from the longer term. In the short to medium range, if you're going to end up trying to hit certain predetermined targets, by definition, because of politics and math and things of that nature, it'd be more on the revenue side in order to be able to hit that target. And that's why I think it's important that you have to end up having a longer term objective using discounted present value dollar concepts, because you can make changes and phase them in over time that may not have a big impact in the short term, could have a huge impact over time due to the power of compounding. So coming back to metrics, we need multiple metrics to be able to demonstrate that, if you will. My personal view is our problem, the $62 trillion problem, is primarily a spending problem. 2 to 3 to 1, okay? But, you know, I think it's 2 to 3 to 1 a spending problem, all right? But you also have to go through a political process to get it resolved. And we'll see where we end up.
I think that one thing I would add is a sustainability criteria, in that what we have now is a dynamic that's unsustainable, with the entitlement programs growing on autopilot, and revenues are programmed to grow also, just not as fast, and so you have this burgeoning gap. So a criteria of mine would be, you know, suppose you were to get the budget to the deficit to a sustainable level, 3% of GDP or lower within, you know, pick your time. The question is that sustainable? You know, will it? Are you just trying to hit a one-shot, so-called touch-and-go landing on the carrier? So I would pick a point to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio as one criteria. I think that sort of says, okay, whatever number you are, let's at least try to stabilize it, stop the bleeding, and then put in place policies that will either keep it there or hopefully even reduce it, but it's going to happen over time, so you got to phase those things in. I think the mix between spending and revenues is probably a large part of that is going to be political, and I think that there'll probably be a higher revenue component than you suggested on the 80-20, because I think the politics of it will probably demand that, because there have to be trade-offs and compromises have to be made. In terms of the where you have the revenue and spending line, where you try to balance them out, it's going to be higher than it's been in the past. We've had, going back to one of my first charts, spending at 21% of GDP, revenues at 18% of GDP. Why can't we continue to do that? Because we've got an aging population. And so inevitably, whatever you do with healthcare, with Social Security, any politically viable changes, you're still going to have many more beneficiaries consuming healthcare costs, and so spending is going to reset at a higher level. And that means that revenues are going to have to reset at a higher level. Exactly where that is, that probably is also a political decision, but we need to get beyond the 21-18 and people trying to keep it in that same box.
Doug had to step out for a second. I am not Doug. I did not radically transform. It would be a step up if I did. I know it's a little past 9. I know we have to be somewhere around 10 UNH. That said, I know there are 2 folks who've had their hands up for a long time. Given the time constraint, if we keep them pretty quick in a question of response, and we'll end there. But we got Steve, and I saw Tim's hand up a few minutes ago. So, Steve.
Lightning round.
Lightning round.
Yeah. Good morning. Thanks for what you're doing. I wondered what you think of the Wyden-Bennett approach to healthcare reform, and if you could explain just briefly for our audience what that is and what your view of its prospects.
Lightning round answer, its prospects are dismal. It was a very, very different approach to the insurance reforms in particular. I think the key thing to remember about healthcare reform, Wyden Bennett, what we did is you have two problems: healthcare costs, expanding coverage. The right way to do it from a fiscal point of view was control costs, use cost savings to be funneled into coverage expansions. We did coverage expansions without controlling costs. We would have done the same thing probably with Wyden Bennett because we didn't have enough cost control in that. And so we need to rethink going forward, because we've now made promises for additional beneficiaries that we do not have the savings to fulfill, and that is our problem.
It was better than what passed, but not good enough, and we're going to have a discussion with the American people about what level of universal coverage is affordable and sustainable over time, and what are we going to have to do to reduce healthcare costs, reduce the rate of increase, and stabilize healthcare as a percentage of the economy adjusted for demographics.
Okay, I guess I get the last question here. It'll be quick. I'm a big graphs person. One of the first bar graphs that went up, which showed the revenue side of things, and I'm pretty much a layman at understanding where this revenue comes from. It seemed to me that the corporate tax, the state taxes, is such a small percentage of revenue, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, and as part of the solution, you understand there have to be things on the cut side. Is there a misbalance in where the revenue is coming from, and that there's too little coming from the corporate and estate, and there's another category called other, but it's a fraction of the percent of Social Security and income taxes?
Most of the taxes come from individual taxes, income taxes, payroll taxes, which are paid both by the employer and the individual, but let's face it, it's part of compensation, so it's really paid by the employee, part of their compensation. I think the bottom line is that I would argue, and you may or may not agree, that we need to dramatically reduce corporate taxes in order to improve our competitive posture and in order to provide incentives for people to be able to create jobs here. At the federal level, corporate taxes are about 7% of revenues. It's not that significant. And I think we need to move more towards consumption taxes, which will make sure that individuals end up paying part of the price of the constitutional roles of the federal government. Over 42% of people don't make any contribution towards the constitutional roles of the federal government today, and going up. And furthermore, to try to make sure that those who are truly wealthy, who end up spending a lot more money than they make, and a lot of their income is based on investments, that they will end up paying more share of the burden than otherwise would be the case. On the estate tax, my personal view is that, people call it the death tax. What about the birth burden? The fact that every baby is born with a $200,000 plus bill? We're not paying our way on taxes. If we were paying our way on taxes, then I think the idea of the death tax would have more resonance. I think that we need to have a higher exemption, a lower rate, but we shouldn't exempt it. Not because of revenue reasons. What would the country look like in 100 years with regard to the gap between the haves and the have-nots? Second, third, fourth, fifth generation inherited wealth is not a pretty picture in many circumstances.
So I would divide the world slightly differently. I mean, if you look at the way our taxes are structured, some taxes are dedicated to particular programs. The payroll taxes are dedicated to the decent entitlement programs, Medicaid and Medicare, and those don't pay for those programs. So observation number one is the earmark taxes aren't sufficient, and those programs are stealing from general revenue. With respect to general revenue, people pay taxes in the end. They pay them in the form of higher prices, lower wages, something. And so what we need to do is what Bell mentioned, which is let's have a tax reform that raises the necessary revenue in a much more efficient fashion. And as part of that, we might collect it through corporations and a business level tax, and on paper, change that mix. But in the end, it's the people of America are going to pay those taxes, and we simply have to have a better tax system to finance the general government.
I totally agree with Doug on that. I would just add that one idea that's floating around now that appeals to me, and I've written about, is to put in place a value-added tax in the U.S., get rid of the income tax for everyone except the top tier, and use the value-added tax to pay for everything that the federal government does in the healthcare arena, freeing up other resources to be used to reduce the deficit. The merit of linking a value-added tax to healthcare expenditures is it would help people to see that if they want more and more healthcare, which is a valuable commodity after all, that's fine, but the VAT tax rate is going to have to go up as healthcare becomes more expensive, and they'll see the linkage, and maybe they'll begin to bring the right kind of pressure on getting the healthcare system to also be more efficient, as Doug talked about earlier.
Okay, with that, thank you for sticking around. We'll pass down the questions. Thank you for your questions.